I found it in the tin sap bucket, the one my father used to hang on the old cannon fir by the sugar shed. That bucket should have been rusted and empty. Instead it held the original will, or at least the last page of it, the real one, and a note in his handwriting that stopped my heart. My sister and her husband would lose everything before the snow melted, the sale of the farm would be voided, and she would end up pruning trees on my land in a smark that says sheared my inheritance. I know how that sounds, but before you judge me, understand this. It took 27 years of mopping school hallways, one forged deed, a fake collapse in a kitchen, and a $5 lockpick set to get from that bucket to the day the deed recorder stamped her fraud into the public record. My name is Margaret, though everyone calls me Meg. For 27 years I was a head custodian at Lincoln Elementary, third shift, the woman who stripped the floors and rebuilt the boiler when the contractor said it was dead. I never married, never had kids. The school was my life until the phone call came about my father. He was 81, a Christmas tree farmer up in northern Michigan, and his heart was giving out. He asked me to come home, so I did. I left my apartment, took a leave from the school, and drove north to the 40-acre farm where I grew up, the one with the crooked row of blue spruce, and the hand-painted sign that said Balsam Ridge. My sister Celeste had never left town. She married a financial consultant named Todd who wore expensive loafers in the mud and referred to the farm as an asset. My father called him the accountant. He never said it like a compliment. So I moved into the spare bedroom in the old farmhouse, the one with the sloped ceiling and the smell of pine needles and diesel fuel. I cooked for him, drove him to his cardiology appointments, managed the tractor, the pruning crew, the wholesale orders, all of it. Celeste visited twice a week, always with a brochure for an assisted living facility, always with Todd trailing behind her like a man who thought he might step in fertilizer and dissolve. 3 weeks after I moved home, my father called me into the living room alone. He was in his recliner by the wood stove, a pen in his hand, a stack of papers on his lap. "This farm skips a generation," he said. "Your mother and I agreed years ago. Celeste gets the sentimental items, the family Bible, the old china, and a small cash gift. You get 60% of the farm. The rest goes to my brother in Ohio." He said he had filed the will with the county probate court, and he handed me a copy. Then he pointed to the shelf by the door. "If anything ever goes sideways, you look in the sap bucket." I assumed he meant the maple syrup operation. I should have known better. 10 days later he died in his sleep. The funeral was on a cold Tuesday in November. Celeste wore a black cashmere coat and cried on cue for the minister. Todd stood beside her with his hands folded like a bank executive at a foreclosure auction. I sat in the front row with a throat so tight I could barely swallow. The funeral home had a popcorn machine in the lobby, and the whole room smelled like butter instead of pine. I remember that detail because it felt like the first sign that nothing was sacred anymore. The day after the funeral, the vultures started circling. Celeste and Todd showed up at the farmhouse while I was still in my father's flannel shirt, drinking black coffee and staring at the chipmunk damage on the back porch. Todd had a leather briefcase. Celeste had a binder with tabs. They wanted to talk about the estate. My father's will was the old one from 2012, Todd told me, the one that split everything down the middle. But the farm operated at a loss and the house needed $50,000 in repairs, so the best option was to sell the property to a holiday lot chain that had been making offers. They called the chain Evergreen Prime Holdings, and they were willing to pay $690,000. After paying off my father's deferred maintenance, his farm equipment loans, and his line of credit, there would be a small disbursement for each heir. Maybe $20,000 each if we were lucky. They sat at the kitchen table and slid a stack of documents toward me. A purchase agreement, a power of attorney, a quitclaim deed, and a disclosure waiver. Todd smiled. "We just want to take care of you, Meg, you've been through so much." That was the moment I saw it. The brass andirons from my mother's fireplace were already missing. They had been taken to an estate buyer that morning. While they were talking, Celeste had also been making a pile of my father's things she called junk for the dump. A cracked birdhouse, a stack of old seed catalogues, a pair of his work gloves with the fingers worn through, and the tin sap bucket. She picked it up by the wire handle and said, "This is rusted through, we should toss it." I said I would take the dump run myself. She gave me that thin, impatient smile she has when she is doing someone a favor, and said fine. Then she dropped the bucket into a cardboard box by the door. I waited until they left. I waited until Todd's car had cleared the bottom of the driveway and the sound of the tires on the gravel faded into the woodline. Then I pulled that bucket out of the box and carried it into the kitchen. It was heavier than it should have been. Inside, under a folded square of burlap, I found 3 things: a brass safe deposit key, a yellow index card with my father's handwriting, 3 lines. Meg, if you are reading this, the kids came for the farm. Do not trust them. Save yourself. And the last page of a will, the signature page with his lassoed capital H and a notary stamp dated 9 months before he died. I stood there in the cold kitchen with the bucket in my hands, and I read that note 6 times. The farmhouse was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The chipmunk had come back to the porch and was staring at me through the glass. That was the moment the grief stopped being soft and started being a plan. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family is just another word for people who know exactly where to hide the knife. Now let me tell you how I went to war with my own sister and her accountant husband. I did not tell them no. I told them I was too tired to think. I said I was foggy, that the grief had made everything swimmy, that I just needed a few weeks to process. This was a performance. I had been married to a man once for 4 years, and I had learned how to make myself small and forgettable. But after that marriage ended and I spent 2 decades reading contracts for the custodial union, I also learned how to smile and nod while someone told me exactly what they planned to take. So I played the grieving older sister, the spinster with no financial literacy, the woman who would sign anything if the language sounded warm enough. I did not sign anything, not the purchase agreement, not the power of attorney, not the waiver. I told them I needed time, and then I asked if I could stay at their house for a few days while the farmhouse was being winterized. They almost smiled too quickly. Of course, they said. That was exactly what they wanted. They moved me into Celeste's guest room that same afternoon, a beige box above the garage with a motion sensor light that clicked on every time I rolled over. They thought they were containing me. 24 hours later, I understood why they wanted me under their roof. The manipulation phase was almost elegant. Every night Celeste cooked dinner, and every night Todd explained how generous the offer was, how time was of the essence, how the property taxes and insurance were draining the estate account. He used phrases like basis step up and 1031 exchange and reverse mortgage integration. He mentioned that my father had taken out a home equity line of credit against the farm in 2019, and if we didn't close soon, the lender might place a lien against the property. That was a lie. I found the amortization schedule later in a shred bin. There was no HELOC. There was a reverse mortgage application, but it was not in my father's name. It was in Celeste's. She had tried to borrow against the farm while he was still alive, and his signature on the application was forged. I did not know that yet. All I knew was that Todd spoke to me in the same tone the school superintendent used when he fired the night crew to hire a cheaper contractor. Slow, patient, and full of condescension. I sat at their dinner table with my hands in my lap, and I watched. I counted the billable hours in Todd's 3 phones, the ones that buzzed during meals, but went to voicemail when the call was from a 212 or 312 area code. I counted the credit card statements that arrived in the mail and were opened, and then hidden under a stack of Bon Appetit magazines. I noticed that the thermostat in their house was set to 68, but their Lexus was idling in the driveway at 7 every morning for half an hour, burning premium fuel while Todd listened to yacht rock and did something on his iPad. That behavior pattern was one of the red flags. The other was Celeste. She would get a phone call and step out onto the deck in her bare feet, even when it was 35 degrees, and she would pace in the same horseshoe pattern over and over, her voice a tight little hiss. I could not hear the words through the glass, but I could read her shoulders. People about to lose money all carry their shoulders the same way. I spent my first week in their house pretending to be docile, but I was also doing housework. That was my cover. I would fetch the mail, fold the laundry, reorganize the pantry, and while I was doing that I was looking. Todd had a home office off the kitchen, a converted mudroom with a deadbolt on the door and a shredder bin beside it. The shredder was a cheap cross-cut model, a Royal Sovereign, the kind you buy at an office supply store for $49. It was always full. I started emptying it because a houseguest who empties the shred bin is invisible, and every time I emptied it I looked at the little strips. A cross-cut shredder turns paper into confetti, but if you are patient and you have good eyes and you know how to read the jagged edge of a number, you can reconstruct a lot. I would spread the strips on a white dish towel on my bed and sort them by color and by the direction of the fibers. I found bank account numbers from a bank in the Cayman Islands. I found wire transfer confirmations with amounts that looked like $8,000 headed to a mortgage servicer in Scottsdale. I found a letter from a collection agency with the word default in bold print. I also found the smoking gun, or at least the first whisper of it. A fragment of a document that listed my father's farm parcel number, the one from the county tax roll, and the words lifetime transfer. I did not know what that meant yet, but I folded the strips into a napkin and kept them in the pocket of my jeans. The moment that changed everything happened during a small household accident. It was a Thursday afternoon, and a fuse blew in the kitchen while Celeste was making a smoothie. The whole east side of the house went dark. She stood in the middle of the kitchen with a half-blended kale shake and looked at me, this blank helpless expression on her face, like a person who had never once opened a breaker panel. Todd was in his office with the door locked, but the deadbolt clicked and he came out with his phone in his hand. I walked to the utility room, found the panel, checked the tripped breaker, reset it, and then asked if they had any fuses on hand in case it happened again. Todd looked at me like I had just recited Latin. That was the moment I understood the full shape of what was happening. These two could not fix a blown fuse. They could not build anything. They could only exploit. All their apparent prosperity was a costume, a stack of credit card statements and luxury leases, and my father's 40 acres was the only real asset they had ever gotten close to, so I played it even weaker. The next day I told them I was still not ready to sign. Celeste slapped the doorframe and then caught herself and called me sweetheart. Todd took me out to the driveway and showed me a new watch, a Breitling, and said we could all have nice things if I just stopped being so difficult. I smiled and said I was almost there, just a few more days. I started going through their filing cabinet that same week. The cabinet was in the garage, behind the recycling bins, and it had a simple wafer lock. I did not break it. I picked it. I had learned lockpicking from a maintenance guy named Louis back at Lincoln Elementary after the school board cut our security budget, and we had to open 17 classrooms with a broken master key. Louis taught me the basics on a practice lock he kept in his toolbox: tension wrench, short hook, rake, half diamond. He said a wafer lock on a filing cabinet is easier than a hallway locker. He was right. It took me 11 seconds. The first thing I did before opening the drawer was put on a pair of nitrile gloves from under the sink. Not because I was worried about prints so much as because I did not want to leave the faint grease of my fingers on the metal. Old habit from cleaning a school and knowing how easy it is to see where someone has been. Inside the cabinet I found a folder labeled Estate of Henry Callahan. Inside that folder was a copy of the will, the one from 2012, the one that gave Celeste and me each 40% and my uncle 20%. I had seen that will. It was notarized, it was filed, but it was also not the final will. My father had told me about the new one, the one that gave me 60%. The problem was I did not have a full copy. I had only the last page from the sap bucket, the one with his signature and the notary stamp, so I kept digging. In the back of the filing cabinet, under a stack of old tax returns, I found a manila envelope with a red string tie. Inside was a quitclaim deed, notarized and dated 3 weeks before my father died. The grantor was Henry Callahan, my father. The grantee was Celeste Callahan Reed. The parcel number matched the 40 acres, and the signature on the deed was not my father's. I know my father's handwriting. He had a distinctive capital H with a loop at the bottom like a lasso, and his pen strokes slanted left. This signature was stiff, traced, the H too small and the lines too careful. It was a forged deed. They had prepared it while he was still alive. They had waited for him to die, and then they filed it with the county register of deeds, probably the same week as the funeral. That was why they wanted me under their roof, why they pressed me to sign the quitclaim and the waiver. They needed me to ratify the fraudulent transfer, to sign away my 60% so the sale to Evergreen Prime Holdings could close. If they could get my signature on that quitclaim, the forged deed would be buried under a legitimate one. The house, the barn, the sugaring operation, the future value of the farm, all of it, gone, and they would pay me off with a check for $4,900, which Todd had already drafted, labeled wreath disbursement. I found a copy of that check stub in the same folder. The memo line said wreath. The cruelty of that detail has never left me. It was the first time I understood that they did not just want the money. They wanted to humiliate me. I needed proof that the signature was forged, and I needed the original will. I also needed an ally. That ally turned out to be my father, who had planned for this 3 years before he died. I found the rest of the will the next morning. I drove back to the farmhouse under the pretense of checking the furnace. The house was cold and empty, and the sap bucket was still on the kitchen counter where I had left it. I had not had time to look at the small USB drive that had been wrapped in the burlap. I had only carried it with me. Now I plugged it into my father's old computer in the corner of the living room, the one with the dust cover still on it and the boot-up sound like a small animal waking. The drive contained a single folder named for Meg. Inside were 3 files, a scanned copy of the complete will, all 14 pages including the codicil, a letter from my father explaining what he had done and why, and a spreadsheet of every asset, every account, and every debt on the farm, with the ones that were real and the ones that were fake. The letter was short. It told me he had suspected Celeste and Todd of financial exploitation for years. He had changed the will in secret and filed it with the probate court, but he had also planted the copy in the sap bucket because he did not trust the court to notify me. He had been that sick and that clear-eyed. I did not go to the bank that day. I waited until Todd and Celeste both left the house for what Todd called a strategy dinner, which I later learned was a meeting with the Evergreen Regional Acquisitions manager at a winery in Suttons Bay. I wore my father's old barn coat, and I drove his pickup, the one with the cracked vinyl seat and the pine needle air freshener, because they had no GPS tracker on that one. The bank was closed by the time I got there, but the safe deposit vault has a separate entrance with a night attendant. I presented the key and my father's death certificate, which I had taken from the probate packet in Todd's filing cabinet. The attendant checked my ID, checked the signature card on file, and then walked me to a long wall of brass doors. My father had arranged it so that I was a co-renter on the box. That was why he needed me physically present. The bank could not open the box without me and my signature. No one could. The contents were mine to access with the key. Inside the box was a single folder with a red seal. It was the original will, the one I had seen him draft on his lap. It was notarized and dated, and it had a codicil that outlined a specific condition. The 60% share could only be transferred if I appeared in person at the probate court and signed a transfer instrument. A digital signature was not accepted. A power of attorney was not accepted. I had to be physically present and willing. If I died, the share would not pass to Celeste. It would pass to the state of Michigan as a trust for public school maintenance. That was the dead man's switch. My father had built a legal tripwire that required my living, breathing, willing presence to do anything with the land. He had made it so that Celeste could forge my signature, forge his signature, forge a whole library of documents, and it still would not matter. The probate court would reject any transfer without my in-person verification. My sister and her husband had spent 3 years building a fraud that collapsed the moment I refused to walk into the county clerk's office. All they had was a forged deed and a pending sale that could never close. I sat in the bank parking lot and I cried, not out of grief, not then. I cried because I understood how much my father had loved me and how long he had watched Celeste sharpen her knives. He had not been able to stop her, but he had made her scheme dependent on my cooperation. He had handed me the only weapon that mattered, my own refusal. The next day I called a lawyer, not the probate attorney Todd had recommended, a woman named Dana Witt who sent me holiday cards every year. I called a woman named Ruth Arkaffer, an estate litigator in Grand Rapids who had represented one of my union brothers in a trust dispute. I told her everything. She listened for 7 minutes without speaking, and then she said, "I need you to get me that forged deed, not a photocopy, the original, and I need you to keep letting them believe you will sign." She also asked if I was willing to help gather final proof. I said yes. She said there was a federal angle here, because the sale to Evergreen Prime Holdings involved an interstate chain and a federally insured lender. The forged deed had been used as collateral on a loan application filed with a bank in Chicago. That made it bank fraud. That made it wire fraud. That made Todd a man facing a lot more than probate court. She also told me that the IRS might be interested in the missing gift tax return, but the federal bank fraud was the hammer. I asked her how much time she needed. She said 3 weeks to put the case together, to get the handwriting expert, to file a lis pendens on the property title. That meant a pending lawsuit notice that would block any sale. She told me to stay in their house, keep playing foggy, and not to confront them. I said I could do that. I had spent 27 years smiling through things I did not want to smile through. So I went back to the guest room above the garage and I waited. The next morning I staged a fake collapse. This was not subtle. I was making breakfast, my father's pancake recipe with the vanilla and the nutmeg, and I dropped the spatula and grabbed the counter and then went down hard on the tile. I made sure my eyes were open because I wanted to see what they would do. Celeste stepped over my body. She did not kneel. She did not check my pulse. She stepped over me and opened the drawer where I kept my purse and the probate documents Todd had asked me to sign. She started rifling through it. Todd came in from the office and looked down at me with this flat little expression, like I was a raccoon that had gotten into the trash. He said, "Where is the signed quitclaim?" And he was not asking me, he was asking her. She said she couldn't find it. They argued while I lay there on the tile, listening, waiting to see if either of them would call 911. Neither did. That was the maximum cruelty beat. That was the moment the last warm cell in my chest for my sister turned to ice. She would have let me die on that floor if she could have found my signature. The woman I had shared a bedroom with as a child, the woman I had taught to ride a bike on the farm road, stepped over my dying body to grab a document. I gave it 30 seconds and then I opened my eyes and said, "I think I fainted." Celeste bent down and tilted her head and said, "You scared us." Her hand was still in my purse. I smiled at her and said, "I know." After that, I stopped being careful about hiding my competence. I started checking the county recorder's website on my phone in the kitchen, and I noticed that the forged deed had been recorded 11 days after my father's death. The transfer date listed was 3 weeks before he died. If he transferred the deed while he was alive, that was a gift. If it was a gift, it should have been reported to the IRS on a Form 709 gift tax return. Todd had not filed one. That was another federal offense. Ruth said the IRS would not care about that amount unless it was part of a larger pattern, but the bank fraud angle alone was worth up to 30 years. She also said the probate court would void the forged deed the moment we presented the original will and a handwriting expert's affidavit. I asked about the handwriting expert. She had one on retainer, a retired postal inspector named Frank DeLuca, who had spent 40 years testifying about forged documents. He could compare the signature on the deed to the signature on my father's driver's license, his tax returns, his real will, and a stack of birthday cards I had saved since I was a child. She sent a courier to their house to pick up the forged deed the next afternoon. I wrapped it in a paper towel and put it in a coffee can in the recycling bin. The courier, a woman in a tan uniform with a clipboard, handed me a package of vacuum filters as cover. The deed left the property without Todd or Celeste ever knowing. The confrontation happened on a Wednesday at the branch office of Northern Lakes Bank where the safe deposit box lived. Todd and Celeste drove me there themselves. They thought they had won. That morning Todd had told me the closing was scheduled for the following day, and they needed me to sign a consent to the deed transfer in front of a bank notary. Just a formality, he said. He was wearing a navy suit and a tie the color of a fresh bruise. Celeste sat in the back seat with me, and she held my hand, and she told me how much she loved me, how this was what Dad would have wanted, how we would all be free of the farm and its burdens. I let her hold my hand. I thought about the hallways at Lincoln Elementary, the way the floor wax smelled at 2 in the morning, the way a boiler sounds when it kicks on after a long winter. I thought about my father's hands on the pruning shears. I thought about the tin sap bucket. I did not say a word. At the bank, we walked past the tellers to the safe deposit room. The manager was waiting, a young man named Craig with a burgundy tie and a badge that said Assistant Vice President. He was nervous. He had been told what was coming. I watched his Adam's apple barb as he led us into the small room with the wooden table and the brass lamp. Todd set his briefcase down and slid a stack of papers toward me. "This is the transfer consent," he said. "Just sign where the tabs are." I looked at him. I looked at Celeste. I reached into the pocket of my father's barn coat and pulled out the yellow index card. My father's writing, "Do not trust them, save yourself." I put it on the table between us and I said, "No, that was my line. That was the whole speech." "No." Celeste's face went white, then red, then a kind of grey I had never seen on a human being. Todd laughed, a small dry laugh, and then he said, "Meg, you're being dramatic, just sign the papers." But behind him, through the glass window of the safe deposit room, I could see 2 men in dark windbreakers walking through the front door of the bank. They were followed by a woman in a grey suit carrying a black folio. One of the men was a deputy from the county sheriff's office. The other was a special agent from the FDIC Office of Inspector General. The woman was Ruth Arcaffer. The authorities entered the room, and the deputy asked Todd to step away from the table. He asked if Todd had brought the original deed instruments, and Todd did what guilty men do. He started talking. He said it was all a misunderstanding, that his wife had the documents at home, that they were in escrow, that his lawyer would clear it all up. The special agent asked about the Sunrise Holdings account in the Cayman Islands, the one listed on the wire transfer confirmations I had reconstructed from the shred bin. Todd's mouth kept moving for another 4 seconds, and then it stopped. The deputy read him his rights. Celeste tried to follow him out of the room, but Ruth stepped in front of her and handed her a notice of probate fraud investigation and a temporary injunction voiding the transfer of the parcel. The sale to Evergreen Prime Holdings was suspended pending the handwriting analysis and the probate court's review of the original will. Celeste started to cry, but I did not look at her. I looked down at the table, at the stack of unsigned papers with the little yellow tabs, at the forged deed that had been carried into the bank by my sister's husband, with the confidence of a man who thought he would never be caught. Then I stood up and walked out through the lobby, past the tellers, past the Christmas tree display with the fake snow and the mechanical carolers, and I got into my father's pickup truck and drove back to the 40 acres. The aftermath took months, not days. Todd was charged with bank fraud, wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. He took a plea deal in March and was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. He also forfeited the Breitling, which turned out to be leased. He had financed the watch. He had financed everything. Celeste was not charged with a federal crime, but the county prosecutor charged her with attempted probate fraud and forgery. She accepted a deferred adjudication deal that required her to surrender any claim to the estate and to pay restitution for the forged deed filing. The restitution was not cash. She had no cash. It was paid in labor. That was Ruth's idea. The probate judge, a thoughtful woman named Judge Meredith Cook, agreed to a creative sentence. Celeste would work on the farm under my supervision for 2 years, performing seasonal pruning, harvest and wreath production at minimum wage, with the proceeds applied to her restitution. The smark was my Aunt Barney's idea. It was a forest green work smark with white block letters across the back that said "Sheared my inheritance." Celeste is required to wear it during all community service hours. She has now worked 216 hours at the farm. Her pruning has improved, though her attitude has not. I pay her every Friday with a payroll check that has the docket number printed in the memo line. She does not cash them. She stares at them for a long time and then folds them into tiny squares and puts them in her purse, next to the small brass key from the safe deposit box that she does not know I left in her guest room as a reminder. I now run Balsam of Betrayal Tree Farm. It is not a joke. The name is real. I kept the original balsam fir and blue spruce, and I renegotiated the wholesale contracts with the local nurseries. The farm turned a profit for the first time in 11 years last season. I hired 2 local kids, Evan and Lily, to help with the spring planting, and I taught them how to thread a maple spile and how to check a totes for root rot. I spend my mornings in the sugar shed and my afternoons in the deer fence, repairing the wire where the bucks break through in October. I still have the tin sap bucket. It hangs on the nail by the back door, right where my father left it. Inside it now I keep a small laminated copy of the probate court order voiding the sale, and a note that says, "Save yourself." Not because I need saving anymore, because I want to remember that my father did not stop loving me even when he could not protect me. He built a wall around my share of the farm, and he taught me that the only signature that matters is the one you refuse to give. My sister prunes trees in a smark that tells the truth about her, and every tree tag on the farm prints the docket number of her probate fraud case under the price. Customers ask about it sometimes. I tell them it is a reminder that some people will sell their own family for a wreath. Then I show them where the fresh-cut trees are stacked, and I let them pick one. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? If you made it to the end of this story, that means you believe in earning what you keep and never signing away your own worth. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the quiet people who finally said no. Like this video if you think my father was watching from somewhere and laughing. And remember, the next time someone hands you a pen and a smile, read every word, even the memo line. I'll see you in the next one.